Hello and welcome to another monthly wrap up. I actually got through quite a few books this month. I think I read 9 in total and I DNF'd 1. So we're going to talk about 10 books altogether. And I feel like it's been a bit of a weird month. Like I feel like it's been very hit and miss in terms of the books that I've picked up and in terms of how I found them. So let's talk about them. The first book we have, it's actually one that I started reading last month, but I finished it in August. And I think I mentioned it at the end of my July reading wrap up. And that's Pretty Girls by Karen Slaughter. This is a thriller mystery. And this is probably one of the most sort of gruesome, more on the dark and twisted side of a thriller that I've read. So I would definitely say please check the trigger warnings for this one. There is a lot of description in here. There are a lot of scenes that some people might find quite hard to read because there are some very disturbing things in this book. This basically follows Claire and Lydia, and their sister basically disappeared 20 years ago, and now in present day another teenage girl has gone missing, and they're basically trying to put some pieces together because this girl went missing in a very similar way, and they're basically working to discover the truth of what actually happened 20 years ago and what's happened to the girl that went missing now. This is a very long book. It's honestly about 530 pages. And I think it was too long just because I felt like at times it was kind of dragging, and for a thriller I didn't think it was very twisty. I didn't think there were that many twists. I felt more like it was all kind of slowly revealed and uncovered. I didn't personally find that like my jaw was on the floor. I do think that the writing style is very easy to read and I was invested in the story, but I think just the way that sort of the twists were kind of revealed could have been sort of more in a shocking way. I don't know if that makes any sense. So for a thriller, it wasn't as twisty as I would usually like. I ended up rating this 3 stars, so still a good thriller. I would still definitely recommend it. But like I said, please check the trigger warnings. This is definitely a disturbing book, and it's definitely not going to be for everybody because it is quite descriptive and gruesome at times. And some parts of this book have honestly stuck with me since I put it down, and not necessarily in the best way. And like I said, I genuinely think this could have been 100 pages shorter and it would have been a bit more fast paced, and I think I probably would have enjoyed it a bit more. But overall, I gave this 3 stars. And then I actually filmed a reading vlog of books that I've been putting off. And this is sort of where it went a bit downhill because I feel like I've been putting off books for a reason. And this was very evident when I filmed this reading vlog. The first one that I read for that vlog was It Happened One Summer by Tessa Bailey. Now, I read one of Tessa Bailey's Christmas books last year and really didn't get on with it. I didn't like how she wrote the main guy in that book, so I was very skeptical going into this one. I will say that at the start of this book I was invested and I did feel like there was potential for me to like the whole book, but it just kind of lost me. This basically follows Piper, who's kind of like a wild child, it girl, and she gets into some trouble and her stepdad basically sends her to this small town that's a little fisherman's village type town, and basically tells her that she has to go and fend for herself and provide for herself because she's basically had her whole life having everything given to her and done for her. So he basically sends her to this town to learn what it's like to have responsibility, and she meets Brendan, who is a grumpy fisherman that has basically lived his whole life in this town. I will say I didn't actually mind Piper. I've seen a lot of reviews saying that Piper is a really insufferable character, and I think at the start I completely see where they're coming from, but then she's meant to be like that and you do kind of see her character arc throughout the whole book. I thought she was okay. I can completely see why people are saying that at the start, but I think just bear with it if you want to read this book. Just stick with it because she's not like that for the entire time. Brendan, I didn't like him. I don't know why he was grunting all the time. I didn't like some of the things he said or some of the ways that he thought about her. I didn't like the spy scenes. The spy scenes had me physically cringing. And I thought the romance between them was very fast paced in terms of how quickly they were saying I love you to each other. I just kind of think overall it wasn't for me. There weren't any characters that I absolutely loved or that I felt very connected to, and the romance side of it, like I said, just felt very fast paced for me, and I think that made me less invested because it was kind of less believable. And I ended up rating this 2 stars, which seems really harsh, but I just don't think it was for me. And then I moved on to Do No Harm by Jack Jordan. This is going to be a really short review because I actually DNF'd this book literally within the 3rd chapter. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. The amount of anxiety I had just reading the 1st chapter alone, like why is it actually having this kind of effect on me when I'm reading it? And I just kind of thought, I don't want that in my head. The actual concept of this I actually didn't want in my head. Also from the get-go I didn't like the main character, and then literally in chapter 2 or 3 she starts pulling out her eyelashes and eating them. And I just thought, That's not for me. No, I can't do it anymore. And I just thought, if it's that weird that early on, that just doesn't give me much hope for the rest of this book. And based on the fact that it was literally stressing me out, I was like, I'm not doing it. I can't do it. I can't. So I actually DNF'd this book, which I think is actually only my second DNF of this entire year. And then I read The Paris Apartment by Lucy Fode. This basically follows one apartment building, and we get to see a bit about each person that lives in this apartment building. But we mainly follow Jess, and Jess is visiting her brother who lives in this apartment, and she gets there and he isn't answering his phone, he isn't answering the door, and she manages to get into the building and he's nowhere to be found. So it basically follows her trying to work out what's happened to him, where he's gone, and to do this she's learning more about the people that live in this building. That's basically the concept of this. I was kind of a bit let down by this, just because I usually really like the way that Lucy Fode tells the story. I just found that I wasn't that invested in this one, and I don't really know what it was about it. I just kind of thought it was all a bit weird and quite slow pace, and nearer towards the end there was sort of a massive plot that was sort of revealed, and I really wish that we'd seen that earlier on, because that I found really interesting, and I found like then I was invested in it, but I wish that had been earlier on, because up until then I thought that it was quite slow paced, which I haven't found yet with Lucy Fode's other books that I've read. I've always found that they're quite good page turners, but this one just felt a bit more on the slow side. I also think all the characters in here were quite unlikable, and I feel like they're meant to be, because it's meant to be believable that they all could have a motive of some sort, but I found each character kind of unlikable and also very cryptic. And not cryptic in terms of mysterious, but in terms of kind of borderline annoying. It just kind of gets to the point where you're like, okay, I want to know now. Like I'm kind of done with these cryptic messages and I just want to know a bit more on what's actually going on. So I ended up rating this 2.5, which again seems very harsh, but I think the end sort of plot of this kind of saved it. I think it probably would have been lower if it hadn't been like that at the end, but like I said, I wish we'd seen more of that earlier on, because I think I would have been way more invested. And then I moved on to Twisted Games by Anna Huang, which if you've seen some of my other videos or my monthly TBR videos, you'll know that I avoid this book. I avoid it. It's been on my TBR for the longest time and I just keep putting it off because I didn't really get on with Twisted Love. It just wasn't my type of thing. I didn't really like the main guy character in there. I thought he was too kind of over controlling and possessive, so it made me very nervous going into this one. This I was actually pleasantly surprised with. I thought this was a lot better than Twisted Love personally. I just way preferred Bridget and Reese as characters. I actually liked them individually and I also really liked them together. I also really liked that we saw more of a slow burn with them too, and a lot of time had passed with them being together but nothing actually happening with them. This basically follows Bridget, who's a princess, and her bodyguard Reese, and that's basically the concept of the book. It basically follows them spending time together because obviously he works for her and we get to know them a bit better, but it also follows them trying to kind of stay away from each other in that sense. I actually think the plot was stronger in this one as well, which I can't really say too much without ruining anything, so all I'm going to say is just with the fact that she had to go back home, the plot of it I found was a lot stronger than the first one. I also think the grumpy sunshine trope in here was done so well. I think Reese as a character fits the grumpy side of the grumpy sunshine, and not in a overdone sort of cliche way. Like, it literally just makes sense for his character, and I think that's one of my favourite times that I've seen this trope been done, just because it makes sense for him and it's not just grumpy sunshine for the sake of being grumpy sunshine. Like, based on his history and what he's been through, it just makes sense that he would be like that. I think this could have been a bit shorter. I've really struggled this month with the length of books, and just I feel like if I spend too long in a book I actually get less invested in a weird way. Just if I feel like a book is taking me a while to get through, I feel like I lose interest. This one, at the first half, I literally sped through, and I honestly think it could have probably been 100 pages shorter. I feel like I was kind of losing interest and losing momentum towards the end of this. I ended up rating this 3 stars, which is actually higher than I thought it was going to be, and like I said, I definitely prefer this to Twisted Love. And then I moved on to Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez. This book, I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I couldn't put this book down. And talking of length of books, this was the perfect length. It was perfect. I absolutely loved Daniel and Alexis. I loved how they interacted with each other. I loved their whole dialogue and their back and forth and their banter with each other. I just thought it was so good and it felt very natural. And when I was reading it, I just imagined this whole conversation happening, and I feel like it just flowed really well. Literally from the first chapter, I love how they met. I love the whole like inside jokes that were in here. here and kept being brought up, and I just love this town. There's so many tropes in here that aren't necessarily my favourite thing, but the way that they were done in here worked so well, and it all just felt very natural. That's the best way I can describe it. It didn't feel forced. It didn't feel like she was putting tropes in for the sake of putting tropes in. It just felt very real. This basically follows Alexis, who's a doctor and she's a city girl, and then we have Daniel, who's the small town boy and he's a carpenter, and their lives basically look very, very different, but we see them kind of come together and see that they have this spark, and it just follows their story and how they really want to be together but they can't quite make it work. So it's very much giving small town vibes. There's also the age gap trope in here, and I just really, really enjoyed it. I thought the third act conflict and the arguments that they had worked so well. It's probably one of the best third act conflicts that I've actually read. I think just because it felt very plausible and it felt very real, like it actually could happen. And the dilemma that she was facing, I was literally sat there reading it thinking, girl, I don't know what you're gonna do. I genuinely don't know what you're gonna do. There's no absolute obvious answer, and I just feel like it worked so well because it made sense. It wasn't just a third act conflict for the sake of having a third act conflict. I just really enjoyed it. I had the best time reading it, and it makes me so excited to read the rest in the series. I literally ordered Yours Truly straight away because I have to have that on my TBR, and I would definitely be reading that sometime soon. But I just had a really good time. I really like the way Abby Jimenez writes, and like I said, I just love the banter and the little inside jokes that we have, and I just felt very giddy reading about them too. And I ended up giving this 4 stars, kind of nearing 4.5, but I think I'm gonna settle for 4. And then I picked up The Inmate by Frida McFadden. This was one of my most anticipated reads on my whole TBR. This basically follows Brooke, who's working as a nurse practitioner at a maximum security prison, and she actually knows one of the inmates in this prison, and it goes back and forth between present and past timeline. And in the past, we're following her with a group of high school friends, and they have a night that they all spend together, and something goes really terribly wrong, and it goes back and forth to slowly revealing what happened that night, and then the present day where she's working in this prison and coming into contact with this person that she knows. I will say that it wasn't as prison orientated as I thought it was going to be. I actually found that I was more invested in the past timeline where we were spending time at this party and at this gathering. I found that that was kind of my favourite timeline to be reading because I just wanted to get back to it and find out what actually was going on that night. The actual sort of criminal prison side of it was quite minimal, a lot less than I actually thought it was going to be going into it. I kind of thought it would be similar in War D, just in the fact that a lot of it would be set in the prison, but actually not that much was, which was fine because it was still a really good, fast-paced, easy read, and I was still hooked in this whole story. I feel like there were quite a few questions I had when I finished this, and some of the twists I did guess, and then some of them she was kind of sending us down a road and then she'd switch, and I kind of wish that she'd carried on going down that road because I personally preferred that sort of twist. I know this is so vague for anybody that hasn't read it, but I feel like at the end she kind of was throwing in other sorts of twists, and I kind of preferred the way she was originally going, but I still did really enjoy it, and I rated it 4 stars. And then I read Hits Different by Tasha Guri and Lizzie Huxley Jones. This one we basically followed Cassie, and she's a deaf dancer, and her favourite all-time pop star basically loses her backup dancers and is holding auditions in Ibiza for new ones, and Cassie's best friend basically signs her up, and she ends up going to audition, she ends up going to Ibiza and training, and it basically follows her experience as a deaf dancer, but then also finding herself and setting her own boundaries, and it's very heavy on the sort of self-love aspect. I kind of had it in my head that this was very sort of a rom-com summery vibe. I would actually say the romance part of it was much more of a subplot, it was much more in the background, and there was a lot more focus on just Cassie and her trying to find her way. I also don't know if I was the only one that experienced this, but I actually didn't think this gave massive summery vibes. It was set in Ibiza, but that's about as far as the summery vibes kind of went. I also think this writing style just wasn't for me. It wasn't something that I could connect with. I actually found that I was cringing quite a lot just at the general writing style, which I feel like I haven't really experienced before. I usually cringe at like certain scenes or certain internal dialogue, but literally this whole thing I felt like I was kind of cringing at. It was written very much like a YA, which kind of surprised me because it's not a YA, and I feel like Cassie came across very naive at times, and it just felt very young. I do think there was really good representation in this book, and I also found that learning about somebody and their experiences being deaf was so interesting, and just even things that people who aren't deaf wouldn't even think about or wouldn't even know that are daily struggles or daily worries or thoughts that people who are deaf are struggling with. And I think that part of this was so interesting, and the influence that kind of Tashiguri had on that was very, very clear, and you could see that it was coming from somebody that had experience with that. So I did really like that part of it, and I found that really interesting. I actually ended up rating this a 2/2.5 stars. I'm undecided on which one. I think it's probably more of a 2 stars, which makes me feel bad, but I just think this writing style wasn't for me, wasn't something I connected with. And then I read Daydream by Hannah Grace, and I loved this. I loved this book. If you don't know anything about this book, this is the 3rd one in the Maple Hill series. This basically follows Henry, who's just become the ice hockey captain, and Hallie, who's basically learning to find her way, and she's a book girly and she's got a book club, and it basically follows them becoming friends. So it's quite a slow burn, but then we also have the fake dating trope in there, and at the same time we have friends to lovers, and I just really, really like this. I love how the characters feel so real. I honestly think there is something in this book that everybody can relate to, and the way that certain things are represented in here are just written so well and in such a relatable way. I literally had to get my pens out to annotate this book because there was just so much that I wanted to underline. I like how this felt like a softer book than the other two in the series, just with some of the tropes that were in here, and there's sort of an inexperienced trope going on with Hallie as well, and I actually really like that that was represented. I thought that would be something that I really wouldn't like, but I liked kind of seeing her internal dialogue and her thoughts about it. I really liked how it very much felt like two individual people learning about themselves and who they are and how they're dealing with daily struggles, but then also how these two people have been brought together and how they're learning to navigate each other and be there for each other and learning what each other needs. And I just absolutely love the way that that was done in here, and I thought the communication was really good between them, and I feel like they had a real understanding of each other that maybe other people in their lives don't have of them. And I like that we got to see characters that are quite different from the first 2 books, and I feel like I could honestly talk about this book all day. I just really enjoyed it. I rated it 4 stars, and I would definitely recommend this whole series. And then the final book that I read this month was The Love of My Afterlife by Kirsty Greenwood. This was so funny. The way that I was literally chuckling out loud to this book, I literally couldn't stop giggling. The way that this is written is so funny. It's literally like Bridget Jones kind of humour, and I just loved how light-hearted this was, and it was so much fun. But there was also sort of a deeper message that you could take from it. This basically follows Delphi, who ends up in the afterlife, and when she's there she meets her soulmate, and there's a bit of a mix-up with her soulmate, and her soulmate actually ends up getting sent back to Earth. So she makes a deal with this afterlife therapist who basically says, you have 10 days to go and find your soulmate and get him to kiss you, and if you manage to do that, I'll send you back to Earth. So she gets sent back to Earth with these 10 days, and she has this mission, and along the way she ends up in these really funny, weird predicaments and weird situations, and it is just so much fun. Right from the get-go you could just tell the vibe of this book. I really, really liked the afterlife therapist, Merritt. I loved her. I could just so clearly imagine what she was like and how she was talking, how she was acting. I feel like her character was written so well, and I thought the main character was funny and she was so chaotic, and this is honestly unlike anything that I've read. I really, really liked how we kind of got mini tropes in here. So for example, we got the fake dating trope, but that wasn't the whole book, it was just one scene in the book, and then the next scene would be a different trope, and I really, really liked how that was done. The romance side of this, I will say, for me personally, didn't really have that sort of giddiness to it. I wasn't that invested in them and the sort of romance side of things, and this was just such a funny, unique book, and I rated it 4 stars. It literally makes me laugh even just thinking about it. And they're all the books that I read in August. Book of the month. I feel like this is kind of hard actually, because I feel like I had a lot of 4-star reads. I think book of the month would probably be Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez. I think this is book of the month. Just the way that even when I think about this book I feel all giggly, and just them two and their dynamic with each other, but then also just how real this book felt, and I just feel like the tropes were done so well in a way that wasn't really obvious and kind of in your face, and you didn't even notice that they were there until you really, really thought about it. And I really like the way that Abby Jimenez writes, and it just makes me so excited for the next 2 in the series. So August book of the month is Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez. And that's a wrap. So that brings us to the end of this video. Please let me know what your favourite book that you read this month was. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll hopefully see you in my next video. Goodbye!